Okay, I think I will start with this slide. Yes, the Anthropocene, I guess you've all heard about it. The Anthropocene is not only dating the beginning of strong human impact on geology and climate, but it's also the starting point of accelerating globalization of biota. So, as we can see in the graph here, the number of first records of non-native species is still growing continuously, and more and more species are becoming naturalized somewhere on Earth. And the main reason for this accidental and intentional introduction is the increasing intercontinental trade and travel during the 20th century. So this biotic exchange has raised concern amongst biologists who suspected undesirable ecological and socioeconomic effects. And as we already heard in the presentation from Veronique Muir, then in 1958, Charles Elton laid the foundation of the research area of invasion biology with the book The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants. Since then, invasion biology as a discipline has grown continuously, always with the primary focus of investigating the negative effects of non-native species. And the conclusions from these studies were usually the same. Non-native species have negative impacts on ecosystems, and the eradication or control is the solution to restore the invaded ecosystems back to a pristine stage. And this dichotomous view now on native and non-native species as good, respectively bad species is still deeply rooted amongst invasion biologists and exactly. So, however, this traditional view on non-native species is increasingly perceived as outdated, and renowned ecologists started to question this narrative for a more balanced and pragmatic approach on how to manage non-native species in a globalized world undergoing environmental changes. So as you can see, there I'm showing this article that was published in Nature with the title "Don't Judge Species on Their Origins," and it was one that really started that very heated debate then in the scientific community, where ecologists, invasion biologists, and conservationists, nature conservationists have been involved. So, besides many biases and problems of the research field of traditional invasion biology, where we already also heard some of these biases from Veronique Muir before, one central critique is that the focus lies always on the negative impacts of invasive species, and positive effects are rarely investigated and reported. So this has resulted in a general negative association of non-native species, even though many non-native species never showed any sign of negative impacts. And so I don't want to dismiss the potential risks associated with non-native species, or some of them, but now I'm going to talk about positive aspects of non-native species and also explore the concept of novel ecosystems as an alternative narrative where non-native species can also represent an opportunity for biodiversity conservation. So recently, evidence is growing strongly that non-native species can substantially contribute in general to biodiversity and ecosystem services just by increasing the number of species, but also by being in mutualistic interactions and with other native species. So non-native species are able to engage in mutualistic interactions with native species and also provide regulating and provisioning ecosystem services, as for example showed in this carpenter bee that is native to southern and central Europe, that is foraging here on a Passiflora incarnata from North America. So non-native species also have been shown to compensate local species extinction driven by humans. For example, here, this is a palm tree, the oil palm growing in Bahia in Brazil, where I did some research on novel ecosystems and non-native palm trees. And there it is believed that the long-term survival of a threatened and endangered blonde capuchin monkey was only possible due to the fruits of this non-native oil palm, which is posing an alternative food source for the native, nearly non-existent fruit trees that have been cut down by humans. So, yes. So, and for sure, besides this, the effects that I've already mentioned, there are also economic and social values of non-native species. Economical values, for example, timber products of non-native species in future forests, but also the social values like ornamental plants in gardens, and this is also something that we should not forget. Yeah. So, as I already mentioned, ecosystems consisting of many non-native species have generally been designated as degraded ecosystems, and restoration efforts usually attempted to restore these ecosystems back to a pristine stage, whatever that means, or a pre-degraded stage, and this usually by eradicating non-native species. However, as I stated before, non-native species, they can also contribute to biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, especially under environmental change. So this really calls for a more holistic and balanced objective approach that also acknowledge these potential opportunities of non-native species. And such an approach is the concept of novel ecosystems. So what are novel ecosystems then? How are they defined? So the concept of novel ecosystem was introduced in the beginning of the 21st century by Hobbes and colleagues, and they can be defined as systems where the abiotic conditions, here shown on the x-axis, and the biotic composition shown on the y-axis, have been altered compared to a historical present system. So, for example, extinctions or invasions are responsible for the alteration of the biotic composition, and climate or CO2 concentrations, for example, can be responsible for the alteration of the abiotic conditions. Then further characteristics of novel ecosystems are that they lack historical analogs, that they have been driven by humans, but they will sustain without further human management, and that they are potentially irreversibly altered, meaning that a restoration back to the alternative, to the historic stage, is not feasible anymore. Yeah. But so why do we need this concept of novel ecosystems? So novel ecosystems are present, they are everywhere, so we should not ignore them. So they have become increasingly common during the 20th century, and some studies claim that up to 36% of the terrestrial surface already qualifies as a novel ecosystems. And what is really remarkable is that even though these ecosystems are very prevalent everywhere, the systems have been ignored in ecological research for a long time. So, and they were always just designated as degraded ecosystem. And now this concept pushed the establishment of a new way of thinking about their interventions and responsibilities of, towards this ecosystem, and promotes openness to these new approaches, to all generally new approaches in restoration ecology. Yes. And for example, it also promotes this more pragmatic view that management decisions should be based on not only on specific effects. So now I would like to talk about novel ecosystems that I've been working since over 8 years. So these are the peri-urban forests in southern Switzerland on the southern side of the Alps. This region has a very long history in cultivating exotic plants. And these exotic plants also became symbols of this region, as one can see here on these advisory posters of the tourism industry. And what happened there was that since 15 years one can observe in the forests that many of these ornamental species are naturalizing in the forest, and some also becoming dominant, and they're strongly altering the biotic composition. So just to give you an idea of what kind of species we talk about, it's like mainly species from the Laurophilus evergreen biome. So it's the false camphor tree that in deciduous or historically deciduous forest now is it's the largest evergreen tree that is growing there. Up to 25 meters they can grow. Then there is the Chinese windmill palm. It's as the name says, from China, and in Switzerland it is prohibited, or its trade is prohibited since last September, because it is believed that they really are becoming dominant and having negative impacts. Even though we as researchers, and I do research on that palm a lot, we don't believe that they really are that of a problem, but I will come back to that later. Yes. So, yes, so then beside this biotic change in this ecosystem, we can also observe an abiotic change, and this abiotic change here is temperature. So what this graph here shows is the different biomes, for example, evergreen broadleaf forest or deciduous forest, as a function of precipitation and temperature. And we can see the yellow dot. There is the climate station of Locarno, and of the temperature climate annals from 1961 to 1919. And now, when we look at where we are in 2011 to 2018, it's up in the evergreen broadleaf forest, and before it was in the deciduous forest. So that means the climate now, everywhere, is now a climate where usually in other parts of the world you would have an evergreen forest. But here in southern Switzerland we don't have this evergreen forest, even though they are very well adapted to that climate, just because there was no native source for these non-evergreen trees. So it also means that this ecosystem there, it would be self-sustaining, because the plants are already there, brought there by humans, and the climate is already changing in a way to support actually the establishment of this species. Yes. So this new woody species composition then also would really qualify as an ecosystem, because they lack historical analogs and because they are irreversibly altered. So we cannot restore them back to a pristine stage, also just due to their dimension. And also, it is important to mention that they are now overtaking important ecosystem services as they replace the weakening chestnut forests and overtake the protective function of these forests from landslides. And that is why even though 20 years ago we have looked at these non-native evergreen species as a very problematic species, and also as a very problematic ecosystem that is developing. However, since some years, we start to really see these as these new novel ecosystems there of evergreen trees as a very important ecosystem that provides now an alternative of these aging chestnut trees. So this is a drone picture showing how dense these palms can become. And what is interesting here is that these palms, they really build very dense thickets in the understory. And there they could we believe that they could really have negative impacts because they stop rejuvenating other tree species, also other evergreen tree species. But here also another non-native species is helping, that this palm is not getting too invasive or too dominant in the understory, and it's also another non-native species who is now regulating these other non-native species. And this is the palm borer moth that is now decimating the palm trees there in Switzerland. And in a way that we believe that when there just are some of these species in the forest, they even increase the ecosystem stability, instead of when there are too many, they don't. And this is also thanks to another non-native species, this palm borer moth. So overall, these evergreen forests in southern Switzerland are a striking example, I would say, for a novel ecosystem, one that is very likely better adapted under future climate conditions and thus making the forests there more resilient. So, and whilst the spread in the case of the novel evergreen forest in southern Switzerland was not intended, it was increasingly make sense to also intentionally support migration of non-native plants that are also not necessarily native to a region. Because climate change forces species to extend their ranges to the north usually, or to higher altitudes. And these range expansions cannot take place due to dispersal disabilities, for example. It could increase the species extinction risks and also weaken the resilience of ecosystems in general. So I would also like to show this with an example about the holm oak that I think nearly everyone knows in France, as it is very common in the Mediterranean area. So what we can see here is a map that shows the distribution ranges and losses of the holm oak under two climate scenarios, both for the year 2050. And on the left is a more moderate climate scenario, a more optimistic one, and on the right, climate scenario where we don't expect a lot of CO2 reduction, a very strong scenario. But in both scenarios, what we can see is that the holm oak is losing a quite large area of its current southern distribution range, and that the same potential suitable areas are emerging in the north. So will the holm oak travel without support to these areas that are now really fitting its climatic envelope? It's very likely not happening. So, and that's because the natural migration velocity of the holm oak was reconstructed to be somewhere between 22 and 57 meters per year. And so it will not be able to really keep pace with the changing climate, which is changing way faster. So assisted migration could be a solution here, and gardens and public green spaces in city could play a central role. They could also serve as stepping stones for species that migrate too slowly on their own. So in the picture there, you see a row of that consists of 27 holm oaks in northern Switzerland. This is very rare in Switzerland. In Paris, I've already seen some just in the morning today, but in Switzerland, it's very rare. And I was actually quite happy to see that they are already seeding and establishing close to these planted holm oaks, yes. And so assisted migration will support the needed regime shifts to keep ecosystems resilient, and regime shifts, for example, from the temperate deciduous forests biome to the Mediterranean biome, or like in the case of southern Switzerland, to the evergreen Laurophyllus biome. So this, I think, on this figure, we can really nicely see what I mean with this as stepping stones. So in the first step one, you see that there is the native species range. For example, let's take the Mediterranean with the holm oak, and then the city up there is, for example, Paris. And what we can is also shown is that the heat island effect, cities are always a little bit warmer, so we can before start to plant certain tree species that then should migrate north into this city. And from there, they will then spread out into the environment and exactly, and then build resilient forests of the future. And whilst this concept of assisted migration was a taboo for a long time, it is recently gaining again increasing support among ecologists and even nature conservationists. So that's a good sign for making our ecosystems more resilient, yes, in the future, I guess. So now I would just like to finish my talk with implications of what I said for horticulture. I think all of that what I said goes out of saying that we should really plant site-appropriate plantings, not really focus on native species. We should really think about planting climate-adapted appropriate plantings, and always try to have in general high diversity planting in case certain species will not work. And I think it would be nice to always have in mind which species in the future would need somehow help for migration, so one can really focus on those a little bit more. Yes, so, and these are the 4 take-home messages. So positive effects of native species are still overseen, even though they are prevalent. And I'm happy that now it's this paradigm shift is slowly taking pace, because I think in the early 2000s it already took a little bit of pace, then it was relatively silent, and now with the very warm and dry years of the last 7 years, I think I see really that this paradigm shift about how we think about non-native species is changing again a little bit. Then I see non-native species as part of the solution of mitigating climate change impacts in general, and as again, cities as stepping stones is, I think, what we should do more. Thanks for your patience. Thanks.